Hey everyone, and welcome back to another DIY plywood enclosure build. Although the enclosure I built in this video is smaller than the previous one, it uses all of the same principles. However, this is an abridged presentation, so I don't explain everything in full detail. That said, if you're looking to build a larger enclosure or need further explanation as to what I do in this video, I recommend following the link to watch the original build first. Without further ado, let's begin. To begin, we'll start with the side panels. These boards were elevated using some 2x4 risers and held in place with some buckets. After getting these boards situated, I put down some wood glue and set the back panel on top. Then I used some bar clamps to hold all of the boards together. With the board situated, I pre-drilled some holes along the edge of the board. Then I inserted 1-inch wood screws into all of the holes. I then repeated the same process on the other side. After attaching the boards together, I flipped the entire structure over. Next, I got a small board for the substrate tray. I added some wood glue, clamped this board in place, and attached it with some screws. I proceeded to do the same thing with one of the boards for the light compartment. Afterward, I grabbed some strips of wood and attached them to the inside of the enclosure. With these boards in place, I added several boards to the front of the enclosure using wood glue and clamps. Then I attached a board to the inside of the substrate tray. Next, I flipped the enclosure upside down. Using wood glue, clamps, and screws, I then attached several strips of wood onto the inside of the bottom of the enclosure. These boards will be used to support the bottom panel. Since this build is smaller, it's not necessary to reinforce the bottom otherwise. Then I flip the enclosure back to its upright position and reinforce the strips of wood that create the light compartment. Next, I placed the bottom panel into the base of the enclosure and lightly tapped it down with a hammer. With this board in place, it was then secured using some 1-inch wood screws. Afterward, I used some wood filler to conceal any gaps that were present. These gaps won't weaken the structure at all because we will reinforce the corners with fiberglass later on. From there, I measured and marked a line for the bottom portion of the light compartment. Using this line as a guide, and after applying some wood glue, strips of wood were then screwed in place along the guides. Afterward, I proceeded to add the remaining strips of wood that create the light compartment. With these boards in place, the main structure will be reinforced with some common boards. To do so, I applied some wood glue, clamped the boards in place, and then secured them from the inside of the bottom of the structure using screws. These boards will make the enclosure very strong and hide any of the plywood seams. With the bottom reinforced, the same set of boards were then attached to the top of the enclosure. However, this time around it was a little different. I attached the boards the same way with glue and screws, but a space was left above them. I determined the size of the space by placing some boards on top of the enclosure. These boards will eventually become the lid, which will rest inside of this space. Anyways, I went around the enclosure and attached all of the boards. With the top secured, I attached more common boards to the left and right sides of the enclosure using wood glue and clamps. After letting the glue dry, I attached another set of common boards to the front and back of the enclosure the same way. Now that all of the reinforcement boards are attached to the outside, we can move on to the finishing touches. To start, I attached 1/4 inch thick finishing boards to the openings of the enclosure. These will easily conceal the plywood seams and create a better surface for the epoxy. Much like the other boards, this was done using wood glue and clamps. Next, I used wood filler to conceal any cracks between the pieces of plywood that make the light compartment and to create a smoother surface for the epoxy. Finally, I measured and drilled the holes for the light compartment. With the main structure completely finished, we'll move on to the epoxy. Like last time, I'm using white pond armor 2-part epoxy. I'm using this because it will seal the wood permanently from water and it's safe for reptiles. I'm looking to make something that will last long term, not a fleeting solution. If you want to learn more about this process, be sure to watch the original build. After covering the inside of the structure with epoxy, I applied it to the boards that will be used to create the top of the enclosure. With 3 coats of epoxy applied and cured, the exterior of the structure was sanded smooth. As always, I start out with some coarse 60 grit sandpaper and worked my way up to some finer 220 grit sandpaper until eventually obtaining a smooth and uniform surface. Next, I measured the inside of the light compartment in order to make a screen. Using these measurements, I cut some lengths of window screen frame. After these were cut out, I added corners to create the main frame and made sure that it fit into the enclosure properly. I then cut out some aluminum screen and using a spline roller, I attached the screen to the frame with the spline. Afterward, I completed the screen by spray painting it white. This will help preserve the aluminum long term from corrosion, but it's not necessary. With the screen completed, I applied a bead of silicone into the groove I measured earlier. Then I set the screen on top of the silicone. After that, I pre-drilled some holes into the screen and inserted the screws into these holes. Now that the screen is in place, I added another bead of silicone, only this time above the frame. Next, I determined how the top board will be situated on the enclosure, and using masking tape I marked for it accordingly. Then I applied a bead of silicone and put the board in place. With this board situated, I screwed it into the main enclosure. Afterward, I went back and sanded a little more just to finalize the overall finish of the wood. I made these enclosures largely out of materials that I already had. That said, the top is actually comprised of 2 boards glued together. So the next step was to simply lay down some wood glue in order to attach the other board. From there it was clamped and just like the others, screwed in place. Then I glued 2 other boards together, which will be used to create a swinging door on the lid. At this point, most of the main components are together. So to move forward with this project, I proceeded to stain everything using an old cloth. After applying 2 coats of stain, I then added 2 coats of triple thick polyurethane. Next, I added a different board to cover the hole into the light compartment. Originally, I intended for this to be how I access the lights, but I felt that it wasn't large enough, so I added the lid on top. From here, I proceeded to make the door. Like the larger build, I used boards cut at a 45-degree angle with a dado cut to create the frame. I placed some 3/32 inch thick glass into the dado cut and then glued the frame together using some wood glue and bar clamps. As is, this won't be strong enough to hold the glass. So after letting the glue dry, I pre-drilled some holes into the corners of the frame, careful not to drill into the glass, and then inserted some construction screws. Next, I taped off the frame in order to apply the silicone. Like last time, I'm using brown silicone too. I ran a bead of silicone, smoothed it with my finger, and removed the tape. From there, I flipped the door over and repeated the same process. This silicone will add a lot of strength to the door overall and hold the glass in place once cured. After letting the silicone cure, I placed the door into the main structure. After getting it properly situated, I measured for some hinges, pre-drilled the holes, and then attached them using screws. From here I needed a way to lock the doors, so I got these small tower bolts and cut out one of the corners. I had to do this so that it would fit on the door like so. After getting the bolt in the right position, I attached it like any other hardware. Then I repeated the same process for the other corner on the door. From here, I drilled a hole through the center of the frame and attached a handle to complete the door. Finally, I put a handle on the lid and secured it to the main structure using some hinges. Lastly, I wanted to add a drain hole so that I can drain out the false bottom periodically. Using a little jig, I placed it on the back of the enclosure and drilled a hole. Then I got a threaded PVC adapter, put an O-ring on the threaded side, and wrapped it with thread tape. This piece was inserted into the hole I drilled just a moment ago from the inside of the enclosure. Then from the outside I screwed on a threaded PVC coupling and tightened it from the inside. Next I got a 90-degree adapter and wrapped the threaded side with thread tape. This adapter was screwed into the PVC coupling. Essentially what I just created is a little makeshift bulkhead. Although it may be waterproof, I want to ensure that it is. So from the inside of the enclosure I applied some silicone. And that completed the build. Here are the finished products. Overall, I really like how these turned out and they're exactly what I wanted. I think what I like most is the viewing panel. Unlike most manufactured enclosures, there are no obstructions whatsoever. These tanks are pretty easy to open and close. I simply unlock the bolts and open the door. They're just as easy to close. Once shut, these doors are shut. As you can see, there's no way my geckos will be able to sneak out. Here's a closer look at the light compartment. When the time comes to change a bulb, it's quite easy. I just open the lid and take the fixture out. Finally, we'll take a look at the drain. Right now, I just have a tube hooked up to it. This tube will later be ran down into a bucket to create a forever drain. However, I'll talk more about this in a later video. And that does it. Like I said, if you want more information on the techniques I used in this video, be sure to check out the original demonstration. Since this is made of wood, it can be easily modified to suit your animal's specific needs. I don't expect that everyone could build something like this, but it's not hard, just time consuming. However, the hard work will pay off because you end up with exactly what you want, and arguably something that looks better than a store-bought enclosure. If you want to see me transform these enclosures into bioactive vivariums for my crested geckos, then stay tuned. That's coming up in the near future. Anyways, as always, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.